Margaret Penrose had always imagined retirement smelling faintly of old paper and bergamot tea, but the day she stepped off the coach in Misty Cove, she inhaled salt, seaweed, and bread baking somewhere up the hill. The village greeted her with small stone cottages, tufted in roses and gulls, that performed aerial pirouettes above a harbour shaped like a crooked smile. After 42 orderly years among card catalogues in Boston, Margaret craved a place where life drifted instead of sprinted. She had brought only 2 companions with her, a leather-bound journal in which she meant to record impressions for a someday memoir, and a cat named Whimsy, who regarded every human rule as an optional suggestion. Whimsy was a silvery tabby with clever green eyes and paws as silent as thought. With him, the term mischievous was both understatement and prophecy. Margaret's rented cottage stood on Seashell Lane, a narrow ribbon of cobblestones leading to the lighthouse that crowned the western cliff. On her first evening, she unpacked her books, hung a framed engraving of Melville above the mantel, and brewed chamomile to celebrate her new chapter. Whimsy, exploring the unfamiliar terrain, wedged himself behind the stovepipe, emerged sooty, and then, while Margaret was distracted by a kettle sigh, pushed open the front door, vanishing into dusk. She found him minutes later, sitting primly on the lane, as though he had summoned her, tail curled like a question mark. A lanky man in oilskin trousers was crouched beside him, chuckling. "Belongs to you, does he?" Nearly trotted straight to the cliffs. Margaret apologized and introduced herself. "Elias Brown," the man replied, touching the brim of a cap embroidered with the image of a lantern. "Keeper of North Star Light. Welcome to Misty Cove, Miss Penrose." They chatted beneath the street lamp's honey glow. Elias spoke fondly of the lighthouse, its first-order Fresnel lens, the rhythmic flash pattern locals called the heartbeat, and the solace it offered passing sailors. Before departing, he pointed toward a whitewashed cottage abutting the beacon. "If you ever fancy a tour, come knock. We're neighbours of sorts." During the days that followed, Margaret settled into a ritual. Morning walks to the village bakery, raspberry scones and gossip served warm, afternoons spent cataloguing her collection of regional folklore, and twilight hours reading on the porch while Whimsy stalked beetles in the hydrangeas. She met Claire O'Leary, the bakery owner whose laughter rang like teaspoons in teacups, and Seth Miller, the young constable whose pockets were perpetually cluttered with dog biscuits for the town's canines. One windy Thursday, exactly 2 weeks after her arrival, Margaret noticed something awry. From her porch, she could see the lighthouse winking its signature 3 short 1 long flash. But that evening, the timing faltered, a hiccup in the heartbeat. She checked again after midnight. The beam had gone dark altogether, and wind carried unease across the rooftops like an errant newspaper. The following morning, the news scattered through Misty Cove faster than gulls on garbage day. Elias Brown was missing. Margaret overheard fragments while selecting scones. "Didn't come into town for supplies," murmured old Mr. Carter, who delivered milk. "No answer when the harbour master signalled," added Claire, her brow creased. Constable Miller posted a notice on the pier requesting volunteers for a search, though the tide was high and waves foamed angrily against the rocks. Despite her retired status, and perhaps because solving puzzles was a librarian's covert sport, Margaret felt a tug of responsibility. She had been the last villager, as far as anyone knew, to speak with Elias. And though Whimsy appeared unimpressed by human drama, he darted around her ankles as if urging action. Margaret found Seth Miller directing volunteers. "I'd like to help," she said. The constable hesitated, surveying her silver hair and sensible shoes. Then he spotted the determination in her gaze. "We'll welcome your eyes along the cliff-top path, but stay clear of the lower rocks, they're slick as eel skin." Whimsy insisted on accompanying her, emitting a plaintive yowl whenever she tried closing him indoors. A cat, Margaret reasoned, possessed balance superior to most humans. She wrapped a scarf against the spray, stuffed biscuits into her pocket, and followed the search party toward the lighthouse. Inside, the tower felt abandoned in a way books never did. Dust motes sparkled through the watchroom, where a mug of coffee, half finished, sat cold beside a weather log. Margaret opened the ledger. The last entry, dated 2 evenings prior, ended mid-sentence. She imagined Elias lifting his pen, distracted by a sound, or someone. She examined the staircase, the oil locker, the tiny bedroom. Nothing hinted at struggle. Whimsy scrambled onto the keeper's desk, sniffing a stack of envelopes. One slipped to the floor, a plain white envelope with no stamp, only Elias's name typed neatly. The flap was unsealed. Margaret read the single line inside. "Meet me where land forgets the sea." A curious phrase, literary almost. She pocketed the note just as Constable Miller summoned everyone outside. High tide limited the shoreline search. They would resume at dawn. Margaret returned home, mind whirring like a microfilm reel. That night, rain rattled shutters, while Whimsy prowled restless loops around the cottage. Margaret spread nautical charts borrowed from the library across her dining table. Where land forgets the sea, she mused aloud. A peninsula? A cave? She traced a finger along the headland and tapped the label Echo Point. According to a footnote, Echo Point jutted far enough that, standing at its tip, one heard neither crash of waves nor cry of gulls, only an eerie hush broken by one's own breath. At first light, she headed for Echo Point. The path wound through heather and stunted pines, the sea murmuring below. Whimsy trotted ahead, tail flagging. Near the tip, fog painted everything in ghostly watercolours. Margaret called Elias's name. Only her own voice answered. On returning to the trail, she nearly tripped over Whimsy, who crouched before a patch of disturbed earth. Cats, she knew, seldom fussed about dirt unless something intriguing lurked beneath. She knelt and brushed away pine needles, revealing the corner of a metal box. Inside lay a folded chart marked with coordinates, a rusted brass key, and a photograph of a smiling young woman leaning against the lighthouse rail. On the back, someone had written, "Find her light." Margaret's pulse quickened. She slid the items into her satchel and scanned the path for observers. None. Whimsy meowed triumphantly, as though awarding himself a medal. Back in town, she visited Claire, who knew everyone's history 4 generations deep. Margaret placed the photograph on the bakery counter. "Recognize her?" Claire's eyes widened. "That's Rose Danforth, Elias's grandmother. She kept the North Star light during the war when the men were off fighting." Claire lowered her voice. "Legend says she hid a cache of emergency gold sovereigns somewhere near the lighthouse, payment from the government in case supply lines failed. Folks have hunted it for decades." A treasure, then. And perhaps someone believed Elias possessed the secret. Margaret showed the note and the chart to Constable Miller. He frowned. "This appears bigger than a lost keeper. Could Elias be chasing family lore himself?" "If so," Margaret said, "why leave his coffee cooling and the light unattended? That isn't his nature." The constable agreed, but was called away to address tourists complaining about the dark beacon. Bureaucracy, Margaret thought, often tangled threads investigators needed free. So she decided to pursue the matter independently, librarian style. She spent the afternoon in Misty Cove's modest archives, inhaling familiar dust as comforting as cinnamon. Old newspaper clippings revealed that Rose Danforth's husband drowned during a storm. Afterward, she seldom left the lighthouse. Rumour hinted she encoded her journals using maritime signal flags. Margaret requested microfiche copies and, with practiced eyes, spotted an odd pattern. Certain journal entries referenced book titles that had nothing to do with the content. Code words, maybe. The retired librarian's heart beat with the thrill of classification. She listed the odd titles: Treasure Island, Gulliver's Travels, Journey to the Centre of the Earth. Each involved travel inward or underground. A cave again. She cross-checked against local geography and realized Echo Point contained a sea cave accessible only at low tide, a place land truly forgot the sea. Whimsy, bored by research, had busied himself stealing paper clips from the reference desk. One clip snagged beneath a cabinet. When Margaret stooped to retrieve it, she discovered a rolled nautical flag chart stuffed behind the baseboard. Someone else had consulted it recently. Evening's amber light filtered across the harbour as she left the library, intent on reaching Echo Point at dawn low tide. She paused outside the general store, where a dark SUV idled, engine purring. Through the windshield, she spotted a newcomer, Harrison Creed, a developer rumoured to covet Lighthouse land for a luxury spa. He leaned over a map. Margaret recognised the Echo Point contours and spoke into a phone. "Meet me at the cave," he said. Her stomach tightened. At midnight, thunder muttered distantly. Margaret dozed in an armchair, Whimsy on her lap, both startled awake by a metallic clink at the back door. A note had been slipped under it. "Stop digging, or you'll join the keeper." Enough, she decided. A librarian could organise knowledge. She could also defend it. She packed a torch, the brass key, biscuits, and a thermos of strong Darjeeling. Then, against all cat-handling logic, she attached a small harness and leash to Whimsy. "You're practically the deputy," she told him. Pre-dawn hush blanketed Misty Cove. The moon, waning, cast silver across wet sand. Reaching Echo Point, Margaret switched on her torch. Whimsy bounded ahead, the leash weaving like ribbon. The cave mouth yawned between two boulders, tidewater dripping from its teeth. She inhaled brine and courage, then ducked inside. The torch illuminated rippled walls flecked with mica. Farther in, water pooled around scattered planks, a makeshift walkway. Footprints glistened. She followed them to a wooden door fitted within natural stone. Heart galloping, she inserted the brass key. The lock surrendered with a sigh. Inside lay a cramped chamber lit by a camping lantern. Maps plastered rock walls. In the corner sat Elias Brown, wrists tied but expression unbroken. "Miss Penrose, how in blazes?" "No time," Margaret whispered, slicing his bonds with a pocket knife, a retirement gift from a grateful patron who claimed every librarian should carry one. Elias flexed his arms. "Creed locked me here after forcing me to decode Granny's journals. He thinks the gold's hidden in the Lighthouse foundation. But the instructions actually lead to her old telescope. She melted the coins and recast them as the lens casing. Genius, really." Footsteps echoed down the passage. The developer's voice drifted. "Make sure the old man's still quiet." Margaret extinguished her torch. Whimsy, ears flat, slipped from her grasp and vanished like a particularly motivated draft. Elias nudged her toward a crevice. They squeezed into darkness just as two figures entered. Creed and a hired thug. Creed's silhouette flickered in lantern glow, impatient. He unlocked the door, found ropes empty. Expletives ricocheted. A sudden yowl erupted from the ceiling beams. Whimsy launched himself onto the thug's shoulder, claws finding purchase. The man flailed, crashed into Creed, and both tumbled. Elias lunged, tackling Creed, while Margaret stomped on the thug's foot with sensible but sturdy heels. She seized a length of rope and, library knots being surprisingly versatile, secured Creed's wrists before he regained footing. The thug, menaced by Whimsy's hissing encore, surrendered. Constable Miller arrived moments later, alerted by Margaret's earlier note left under his station door, describing her suspicions and destination. Seeing the captors trussed like overdue books, he whistled. Remind me never to underestimate library science. The cave's evidence, coupled with Creed's threats and attempt to sabotage a working lighthouse, assured his arrest. Searchers retrieved journals proving Rose Danforth's optical lens ruse. The recast gold remained part of the lighthouse apparatus, lawfully government property. The sovereigns, ironically, had guided mariners for 75 years, treasure shining every night. By sunrise, North Star light pulsed again over an ocean turned rose and gold. Elias, restored to duty, invited Margaret and Whimsy up the tower. She climbed the spiral, legs protesting but heart buoyant. Inside the lantern room, morning sun refracted through the historic lens, scattering tiny rainbows across iron beams. Whimsy chased the colours, batting at air. Elias poured coffee. I owe you my life. Nonsense, Margaret said. I simply followed the clues, and Whimsy enjoys a theatrical rescue. Misty Cove buzzed with the tale all week, embellishments sprouting like beach grass. Some swore Margaret fought Creed single-handed with Cat as projectile. Tourists posed by the cave entrance, where a hand-painted sign now read, Beware, Cat on patrol. Claire created a new pastry named Librarian's Lantern, layers of flaky dough, lemon custard core, dusted with gold sugar. The first samples reached Margaret's porch, accompanied by a handwritten card. Thank you for keeping our light alive. She sat in her rocking chair, nibbling pastry, while Whimsy plotted a seagull heist. Retirement, it seemed, could be catalogued under adventure after all. And as dusk gathered, the lighthouse cast its steady heartbeat, reminding her that some treasures illuminate more than they enrich. That evening, Seth Miller strolled by, tipping his cap. Any chance you'll consider joining the volunteer harbour watch? We could use your kind of sleuthing. Margaret smiled. Provided Whimsy gets a badge. Done, the constable said, utterly serious. The waves rolled in polite applause, and a retired librarian in sensible shoes felt wonderfully, ineffably at home.